thank you very much for coming along to EcoViews and News once again. This evening we want to look at a very important question that's emerging on the global food front, the whole question of Africa. Sometime this week, and it's going to be in the news again and again and again, I'm sure, the world's population is going to reach 7 billion people, and the fastest expanding continent, by everyone's calculation, is Africa. It's also the continent that's feeling the most acute food shortage at this point. There are famines in the Horn of Africa, Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, and there are crises emerging around the country of each one of these individual instances in Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya. But more broadly, in Africa as a whole, there are food shortages. We're reminded of this from time to time with crisis reports from one country after another. Either there's a drought, or there's a flood, or there are various kinds of, in effect, shortage problems. They may be just market shortages or failures of the market, but much of what is being talked about as Africa's agricultural problems these days are being put forward as if there is a problem with learning how to produce food in Africa. Now this is a bit ironic because African agricultural history is among the oldest in the world, and the notion that they are just beginning to have problems is a bit naive. So we're going to want to look a little bit at a series of chapters in African agricultural history. Most recently, there's been an argument that Africa needs a lot of new investment in kinds of things that capital can provide, presumably. And that's led us to think that the new investment is going to solve some of these problems. But at the same time, that some of that new investment is taking on the form of a land grab, that is to say, a rush to new forms of agriculture in Africa, not necessarily for Africa. So there is a mixed bag on this question. Much needed investment or a neo-colonial land grab? That's the problem we want to look at today as a chapter in African agricultural history. There are many other chapters which we can look at and will in the future. But for the time being, let's look at this contest between, does Africa need more new investment in agriculture, or are we up against the kind of neo-colonial land grab that's going on now? The UN obviously has been warning for a while that food prices have been going up, and that we need to pay attention to that on a global basis, not just within Africa, but the food price hike throughout the world has led to scarcities in Africa as well as anywhere else. So we're going to want to look at the way in which global food prices are affecting production in Africa. And they've warned in particular that Africa is vulnerable to these things. You've probably seen the reports. If you haven't, take a look quickly at this.
Young children in India dig through garbage at a community dump in search of food. A severely malnourished child in Ethiopia struggles to survive. These disturbing scenes illustrate the growing problem of hunger around the world. A new UN report says for the first time in history, more than 1 billion people are undernourished worldwide. In the last year, the number has risen by 105 million, meaning that 1 in every 6 people in the world suffers from hunger every day. Avinash Kumar with the food aid organization Oxfam in India says the situation has gotten worse in the last 10 to 15 years.
47% of the children in this country are malnourished. India actually houses more than 1/3 of the hungry people on the global continent.
The study says the world's most populous region in Asia and the Pacific has the largest number of hungry people, 642 million, followed by sub-Saharan Africa with 265 million. Analysts say sub-Saharan African countries have been affected by high food and energy prices as well as the economic recession. Suresh Babu is with the International Food Policy Institute.
We talked about alarming and extremely serious condition in terms of hunger. And look at the countries in the red. And they are Democratic Republic of Congo, you have Burundi, you have Eritrea, Sierra Leone, Chad, and Ethiopia.
Okay, virtually all of those, as you can tell, are in Africa. So it's not just that this is evenly developed around the world as a problem, but it's particularly acute in Africa. These are the kinds of reports that the UN is putting out, the BBC is reporting on, and you can pick them up almost on a daily basis in the news. The UN here, in a report that was put out in Democracy Now! By Amy Goodman and her associates there, refers to a global
This is
silent
Democracy
tsunami.
Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Anjali Comment.
We turn now to what the United Nations World Food Programme has called a silent tsunami of hunger. It's been described as the worst food crisis since the 1970s. According to the Food and Agricultural Organization, more than 1 billion people, or 1/6 of the world's population, go hungry every day. Last year alone, 37 countries experienced riots over skyrocketing food prices. But the world's richest nations have slashed their funding for food aid to their lowest levels in 2 decades. The World Food Programme warned this week that more than 40 million people will have their food rations reduced or eliminated because of the drastic aid cuts.
Okay, well, one of the big things that they're pointing to is that the aid has been cut at the same time that the prices are going up. Now, this is going to lead to a predictable crisis in a lot of parts of the world, especially, again, in Africa. So have a look, then, at what, in fact, is coming down the road in Africa. In fact, there's a lot of investment in new kinds of agriculture in Africa, but it's not seemingly benefiting the Africans. In fact, it seems to be called a land grab for food security. This was in 2009. Oxfam began to draw attention to it. This fellow, particularly Duncan Green, talked about it. But look at, in fact, who's growing what where. I mean, it's no longer just a question of Africans growing things in Africa. Outside sources of finance are, in effect, buying up African land. Take a look at the report by Al Jazeera.
Dividing up the world's bread basket. Rich countries are racing to buy and lease agricultural land abroad and secure their food supplies for the future. Critics are calling it a colonial land grab.
The scale is something we've never seen before. I mean, there are huge pieces of land, 6 million acres in the Congo, bought by China to grow palm oil.
It's reported 40 million hectares of land has been bought or leased in $100 billion worth of deals. Now the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization is proposing a code of conduct to guide the global land grab.
Governments need to be much more assertive. At the moment they're signing away huge pieces of their territory for very little money and very few guarantees. The deals are secret, so if we had some more transparency, if you could see what the deals were, local people could do something about it and get a better deal.
Not only are wealthy companies directly buying and leasing land around the world, they've also started to form local partnerships with companies. And this is so they can get a direct stake in their agricultural industry. Now, one of the companies that's leading the way is actually right here in Qatar. Hassad Food is aiming to not only guarantee Qatar's food security, but become a global food supplier.
We are targeting crops and type of food. So, for instance, if we are talking about sugar, then it has to be in Latin America, precisely in Brazil, or it could be in India. If we are targeting wheat, then it has to be somewhere in Australia, or in Latin America, or in even Eastern Europe.
Now, this is absolutely fascinating here. We have in Qatar a new firm setting itself up basically to aggregate financing to invest anywhere in the world, whether it's wheat in Europe or in parts of Australia, or it's sugar in Cuba or in Brazil. It's basically going to design packages to deliver finances for food production in any part of the world. Now, this gentleman doesn't see any contradiction or any problem with this kind of flow of capital for redirecting local agricultural traditions or productive capacity. Look at the way the interviewer actually poses it.
He says he doesn't know why some people are alarmed about their business.
I have no idea at all.
He has no idea at all why some people are alarmed about the business. Maybe it's because they're buying up land in countries that have traditionally been in charge of their own agriculture. Maybe it's because they're taking that land and producing with it, food for export, no longer for consumption within that country.
But maybe the stereotype of the wealthy countries grabbing the feed from the poor countries.
From Sudan to Romania, anywhere that can grow food is now prime real estate, after governments were rocked by food riots last year. One of the most aggressive buyers has been Saudi Arabia. It's setting up a chain of 1,000 square kilometre farms abroad and plans to ship the food directly to the kingdom. And it seems food prices are about to go back up.
The food prices bottomed out in about March, and now they're going up. They're already to where they were in 2007. If you look at the graph, it's quite scary.
A global grab land. The question is, will there be enough of it to go around? Nicole Johnston, Al Jazeera, Doha.
Devlin Kuyik is at the World Food Security Summit in Rome. He works for GRAIN, an international non-profit organization that supports small farmers. He says the problem of land grabbing has spiraled out of control.
Some farmers' organizations I've talked to have said, hey, if you're going to come in and negotiate a price and you want to purchase food from us, well, we're prepared to sit down at the table with you. But if you want to come in here and buy our farmland, control our farmland and decide where that food is going to be going, there's no way. There's no way we're going to allow for that to happen. So of course, you know, that's a better scenario what you've mentioned. But the reality is that the private investors these days are interested in taking control of the food system.
Now that's the key here. The private owners are taking control of the food system both locally and globally. That is, they're basically producing for a global market, and it doesn't really matter whether local producers are going to feed local population. It doesn't matter to them. If there's no money to purchase that food within the country itself, food goes elsewhere. Food goes to the international market. So as you can see, as they put it on their own report on this, land grabbing has been a setback to fighting hunger in many places. Land grabbing is actually making hunger worse. Now here's a situation where new kinds of investments, you'd think investment in African agriculture would lead to an increase in productivity of African agriculture and a decline in local food crises. But in fact, it's leading to an aggravation of those hunger problems within those areas, because what's being done is the production for foreign export. Take a look. It's really quite staggering.
Identified about $100 billion now being mobilized to buy up farmland, okay, to invest in taking over farms. It's a major new trend. Everything we've heard here says that nobody is dealing with the importance of this issue, the significance of this issue. We're talking about vague codes of conduct that have no teeth. Nobody's addressing the fundamental problem, so it's no surprise that you're seeing countries taking these extreme measures and outsourcing their food production. Really, we have to start looking at how can we get support to farmers. How can small-scale farmers who make up 80% of those who are the hungry in the world today, 80% of that 1 billion who are in the hungry today are small farmers, how can we get support to them to help them produce food, not only for their families and for the local communities, but there could be ways of producing more food globally. And that's a long-term scenario. I mean, this is long-term thinking.
Okay, well, you can get the full report on this by clicking on the links on the website here. But you get the idea. There's a land grab food security, but the food security is not within the countries where there's a land grab. On the contrary, the finances are being used to create for global market, which often accentuates the hunger crisis within the country. Now, there's a woman who's been looking at this in great detail about finance and hunger, and she gave a speech on it recently. Her name is Anurata Mittal. Keep it in mind, because she's coming here to Cambridge later this week, and we all ought to go listen to what she has to say. You can hear it very succinctly here.
The other kind of speculation that I wanted to talk about is in land. The same thing has happened with the collapse of the housing market, with the rise in the food prices, with the financial crisis. Two things have happened. There are food insecure countries such as the Gulf states, South Korea, Japan. They depend nearly on 60% of their food needs are met through food imports. So when the food prices went up, they realized that they need to ensure their food security. So they have been going into very rich areas but poor countries buying up land. Say in Africa, Ethiopia, Sudan, Tanzania. You had countries like India who saw an opportunity to make money, that there is need for food, so they are they're financing the corporations to go into countries like Ethiopia, buy up millions of hectares, actually lease millions of hectares of land to grow cereals for export. And then, of course, you have the private investors from Goldman Sachs to JP Morgan to others who are looking for opportunities to make money, and they realize agriculture is the other sector. So they have been leasing or contracting land or buying land in poor countries, predominantly in Africa, a trend which has come to be known as land grabs. Initially, there was a strong reaction from Food and Agriculture Organization, from IFAD, from the World Bank, expressing concern about its implications on food security for the poor and hungry in third world countries. And immediately, the development discourse took over, which is this is a great win-win situation because investors can make money, the food insecure countries can have access to food, and these poor countries who are cash-strapped can make some money. I mean, while they're at it, they might as well sell their mothers and sisters, right?
Well, you can get a sense of her outrage at this kind of land-grabbing operation. While they're at it, they might as well sell their mothers and sisters, too, she says. Well, this is the woman who's coming to Cambridge later this week, and we all ought to go hear her speak. Ethiopia has been the kind of focal point of a lot of this, and John Vidal, the correspondent for The Guardian newspaper in the UK, has been doing some reporting on it. Notice this was not just a long time ago. This was July 11th, 2011. This is year. This wasn't back in 2009 when they started reporting on these things, but this year. Take a look at the report that he put out. It's pretty staggering. There's actually an ad we probably have to listen to here for a moment. We'll let it go through its ad, or skip the ad, then we can go back to it, but here it is.
This is Ethiopia, one of the hungriest countries in the world. But here, foreign companies are spending billions of dollars to grow food for export. An area the size of Britain has been handed over to corporations in the last 3 years. It's called a land rush. I'm in Ethiopia's remote southwest Gambela region to investigate claims that large numbers of small farmers are being moved off their land by the government.
Now all this land for the next hour of our driving is going to be some kind of farming, intensive industrial agriculture.
We're driving west through Karaturi Farm, a new Indian venture, where large areas of forest are already being cleared to grow palm oil, rice and sugar.
Are you going there? Hello. Hello.
It will be one of the largest farms in Africa, but most of the food will be exported. Populations are growing, so this has to be good for the world. But what about Ethiopia's poor? The man in charge is Kamjit Shekon.
So how big will this whole farm be?
Phase 1, 100,000 hectares.
After that?
After the second phase, 100,000 plus 200,000.
So 300,000 hectares. And if I started walking at one end, how long would it take me to get to the other end?
On 100,000 hectares is about 121 kilometers.
120 kilometers, that's 90 miles.
90 miles.
As big.
Yeah.
It's as big as Wales. So will you build a town just by here?
Yes, you see those trees?
Yes.
There will be the town, next camp coming up.
So that would be Camp 2 and that would be 10,000 people.
Maybe 10 to 15,000.
Karaturi says it will build home schools and clinics for as many as 60,000 workers. But on one of their other Ethiopian farms, similar promises made by the government have yet to be fulfilled. In addition, we found they pay most workers under $1 a day. That's well below what the World Bank says is extreme poverty. I think that because you were the first people here, you've got the best land. I think you've got the river access.
We never saw the land.
Yeah? Oh, you never saw it?
They gave it to us, we took it.
Seriously?
Seriously.
You did not even see it?
Yes.
They offered it to you?
They offered. That's all.
Oh, yeah.
Well, you can see the nature and the scale of the issue. Here are Indian investors buying up land the size of the country of Wales on one project in Ethiopia and basically producing food for export. Well, this is the kind of question then. Is this much needed investment, or is it a kind of neo-colonial land grab that's going on in these areas? As I say, we have the woman who I mentioned earlier coming to Cambridge later this week, Anuradha Mittal. Make the effort to go see her if you possibly can, because she's raising the question, are university endowments investing in these land grabs in Africa? How would they be doing that? Well, as it turns out, it's the investment instruments that are available to hedge funds. European hedge funds have made large-scale investments in African land, resulting in food insecurity, displacement of small farmers, environmental devastation, and further impoverishment of the political instability in the African nations. So, this is the kind of thing reported upon by John Vidal himself in the Guardian newspaper. U.S. universities in Africa are part of the land grab. Institutions, including Harvard and Vanderbilt, reportedly use hedge funds to buy land in deals that may force farmers out. Well, this is pretty explosive material, so we definitely want to hear her. She's speaking on Thursday, the 3rd of November, over in the Ticknor Lounge, which is part of the Boylston Hall there on the Harvard Yard campus. You walk in the Harvard Yard, ask for Boylston Hall, and Ticknor Lounge is on the first floor. So from 4:30 to 6, we're likely to have a very interesting presentation by this woman. Take a stroll over there on Thursday afternoon and find out what's coming on here, because there are further chapters in African agricultural history we're going to want to look at. There are a lot of things that went on during the slave trade, which were enormous. The legitimate commerce of the 19th century transformed all of West African agriculture, certainly. The colonial structuring of African agricultural production took place in East and West Africa well after the slave trade, and had a lot to do with cash crop export production. The free trade agreements since independence in roughly the 1960s have had a huge impact on Africa. So we're going to look at these chapters in the future. Probably keep in touch with them through foodmatters.tv. You can see it under chapters in African agricultural history. But definitely go along on Thursday to this talk. In the meantime, keep in touch with us here at Eco Views and News. We're going to be talking about chapters in African agricultural history, one after another. Thanks very much for keeping in touch, on air or online.
you.